Children. The day they handed Nora Tate to a stranger. The temperature outside Pincher Creek was sitting at -11, and nobody in that post office lineup even looked up from their boots. Children. She was 22. She had $40 in a coin purse her mother had stitched from a flour sack. She had a single carpet bag that held 2 wool dresses, a Bible she never read, children, and a photograph of a dog that had been dead 4 years. That was the sum total of everything that belonged to her. The rest, the farm, the furniture, children, the decision about what came next, had been settled between her father and a man named Arden Holt across a kitchen table she wasn't invited to sit at. Children. The town of Pincher Creek expected her back before the first thaw. They gave her 6 weeks, maybe 8. They were wrong about that. What she built on that land changed everything, including herself. Children. Arden Holte was not what anyone would call a welcoming presence. He was 41, wide through the shoulders, with hands that looked like they'd been shaped by someone who needed tools, not fingers, children. His face was the color and texture of weathered cedar, and he wore a permanent expression of a man doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. He'd lost his wife to a fever 2 winters back, children. He had 4 children who hadn't had a consistent adult in the house since, children. His property, a quarter section northeast of town, butting up against the Porcupine Hills, was producing barely enough to cover the banknote. He needed help. He hadn't asked for a wife. He'd asked Nora's father for a farmhand he could pay in room and board, and somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd cup of rye her father had poured himself, the arrangement had shifted into something permanent. Children. Arden didn't explain this to Nora. He just stood by his truck in front of the post office, nodded once at her carpet bag, and said, "You can put it in the back." Children. The drive took 40 minutes. Arden said 11 words the entire way, and 4 of them were roads bad past the cutoff. The prairie scrolled past in long gray sheets, children. The winter grass flattened and pale under a sky the color of old pewter. Nora pressed her shoulder against the cold window and watched the foothills rise up ahead of them, children, dark and jagged against the low clouds. She had grown up an hour south of here and had never once been to the Holte property, children. She hadn't known it existed until 10 days ago, children. The farmhouse was a 2-story structure of cream-painted wood that had been cream-colored once, decades back. Now it was the gray-white of bare bone. The barn sat to the east, leaning slightly, like something tired. There was a root cellar with a broken latch, a chicken coop with no chickens. 3 rusted pieces of equipment she couldn't name, parked in the yard like monuments to something abandoned, children. A spruce windbreak along the north edge of the property, the trees enormous and old, blocking out whatever sky remained. Children. Before Arden had the truck in park, the front door opened. Children. They came out in a line, more or less. The oldest first, a boy of about 14, tall for his age, wearing an expression of absolute hostility that he made no effort to conceal. Behind him, a girl of 11, children, her hair in 2 mismatched braids, holding the hand of a younger boy who might have been 7, and at the rear, barely visible behind the older girl's coat hem, a small face peering around the doorframe. Children, a girl, maybe 4, children. She was watching Nora with the flat, careful eyes of an animal deciding whether to bolt. Children. The big one's Lorne, Arden said, without looking at any of them. Then Patrice, the little one's Benny, the baby's Rue. Children. Nora got out of the truck. Children. Lorne looked her up and down the way a person assesses a leaking roof, noting all the places it would fail. "She's not staying in Ma's room," he said. Not to Nora. To his father. Children. "She's not," Arden said. Children. Nora picked up her carpet bag. She walked toward the porch without waiting to be invited. Patrice stepped aside. Benny pressed further behind his sister. Only Rue stayed where she was in the doorframe, thumb wedged firmly in her mouth, watching. "Children." "Hi," Nora said to her. "Children." Rue stared back, said nothing, didn't move. "Children." Nora stepped over the threshold. "Children." The smell hit her like a flat hand to the face, sour milk, wet wool that had dried and soured again. The faint ammonia of a mop bucket that hadn't been wrung out properly in a very long time. Children. The kitchen was large and should have been warm, but the wood stove was running low and nobody had fed it. Dishes in the sink, 2 days' worth at least. A coat on the floor. Children. A pair of rubber boots tipped over by the door, one of them containing a hard wedge of something that had once been bread. Children. The linoleum near the stove was dark with grease. The curtains over the kitchen window had been torn, cleanly on purpose, and then pinned back up with a safety pin. Children. Nora set her bag on the table. She looked around the room. She was 22 years old. She had not chosen to be here, and the particular flavor of loneliness closing in around her was unlike anything she'd felt before. Not sadness, something more mechanical than that. The feeling of a door locking from the outside. Children. She found the wood bin. She loaded the stove. Children. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried since she was 17, when she'd understood that crying in her father's house only made things longer. Children. The first week was not difficult in the way she'd expected. It was difficult in a way she had no preparation for. Children. Arden left before 5 in the morning every day to check fences and feed the remaining cattle, 12 head of black Angus that he was trying to keep through the winter on hay that was running short. Children. He came back at dark, ate whatever she put in front of him, and went to bed. He did not explain the property. He did not show her where things were kept. Children. He did not ask her name twice, though she'd told him once in the truck. Children. She had to learn everything by opening drawers. Children. The children gave her nothing to work with. Lorne treated her like furniture he resented having to move around. He did his chores. Children. But he did them in a way that communicated clearly that the chores had nothing to do with her. Patrice was quieter. She watched Nora constantly, a steady. Children. Evaluating attention that felt less hostile than her brother's and more exhausting. Benny was easy enough if you didn't look at him directly. He'd accept being fed without commentary. Children. And Rue followed Nora from room to room without speaking, maintaining a precise distance of about 4 feet, like a satellite that had found its orbit and wasn't ready to do anything else with it. Children. On the 5th day, Lorne dumped a full pot of oatmeal into the sink. Children. He did it quietly, deliberately. He walked to the stove, picked up the pot Nora had been stirring for 20 minutes, carried it to the sink and tilted it. The oatmeal went in with a wet, conclusive sound. He set the pot down on the counter and looked at her. Children. We don't eat that, he said. Children. Nora stood at the stove. She looked at the sink. She looked at the boy. He was 14, and he was big for it. And the set of his jaw was his father's exactly. All that granite stubbornness arranged into a face, still young enough to show how much it was costing him. Children. She didn't yell. She'd been waiting for this. She'd been waiting for the moment when one of them would try to find the edge of her and measure it. Children. She walked to the pantry. She came back with a can of beans, a chunk of salt pork, and a cast-iron pan. She put the pan on the stove and started rendering the pork. Children. Then you'll eat this, she said. Children. She didn't look at him while she said it. She kept her eyes on the pan. Children. Lorne stood by the sink for another few seconds. Then he sat down. Children. He ate 2 helpings. Children. She didn't say anything about that either. Children. The peace, if you could call it that, held through November. It was a cold peace, a functional one. Nora cooked and cleaned and learned the property room by room, corner by corner. She found the broken hinge on the cellar door and fixed it with wire and a screw she pulled from a coffee tin in the workshop. She found the leak in the roof of the mudroom and stuffed it with rags until the freeze sealed it. Children. She found in a cedar chest in the upstairs hall a stack of Patrice's drawings, careful, detailed things, horses mostly, rendered in pencil on the backs of old grain receipts, and she left them exactly as she'd found them. But she mentioned to Patrice at dinner that night that she'd seen a box of charcoal pencils at the co-op in town. Children. Patrice looked up from her plate. It was the first time Nora had seen the girl's expression shift into something that wasn't calculation. Children. She didn't say thank you. But the next morning Patrice refilled the wood bin without being asked. Children. The illness started on a Wednesday, 2 weeks into December. Arden had driven to Lethbridge to pick up a part for the baler, a 2-day trip, possibly 3 if the roads closed. Nora was alone with the 4 of them when Rue woke up wrong. Children. She heard it before she saw it. A sound from the small bedroom off the kitchen where Rue slept, not crying, something worse. A thin, effortful sound like a small engine struggling to turn over. Nora pushed the door open. Rue was sitting upright in her cot, her eyes open but not focused. Her breathing was audible from the doorway. Her lips had the faint blue-white tinge of skim milk. Children. Nora crossed the room in 3 steps. She put her hand on the child's forehead and felt the heat rise against her palm like a hot stone. Children. Lorne appeared in the doorway behind her. She hadn't heard him come down. Children. That's what happened to Benny last winter, he said. His voice had gone very flat. He turned that color. Children. Nora didn't answer. She was already pulling Rue out of the cot, wrapping the blanket around her. Children. Get the kettle, she said. Children. She needs a doctor. Children. I know she needs a doctor. The roads drifted shut past the cutoff. Get the kettle. Children. There was a half-second pause. Then she heard Lorne moving toward the kitchen. Children. For the next 36 hours, the farmhouse became something Nora would not have a word for until much later. A furnace, a held breath. She got Rue into the kitchen, closest to the stove, and she worked. She boiled water and made a steam tent from a wool blanket draped over 2 chairs, holding Rue inside it while the child thrashed and cried and tried to bite her thumb. Children. She mixed honey with dried thyme she found in a jar at the back of the spice cupboard and got it down Rue's throat in small, patient doses. She monitored the fever the way she'd been taught. Forehead, neck, children. Behind the ears, and when it spiked in the small hours of the first night, children. She packed Rue's feet in cold cloths and sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the stove and the child in her lap, and she did not sleep. Children. Lorne stayed up with her. Children. He didn't say much. He brought wood without being asked. He heated water. At 2 a.m. he made tea, badly, too strong, but he brought it to her without a word and set it on the floor beside her. He sat across the kitchen in the wooden chair, by the window, one knee up, watching Rue's chest rise and fall in Nora's arms. His face in the dark was unreadable, but he didn't leave. Children. Around 4 a.m, Rue's breathing smoothed out. Children. Not completely. But the awful wet rattle in it softened. Nora felt the fever begin its retreat the way you feel a storm pulling back. Not gone, but no longer directly overhead. She exhaled slowly. She hadn't known. She'd been holding her breath for the better part of an hour. Children. She looked up. Children. Lorne was watching her, not his sister her. Children. He looked away immediately, out the dark window. His jaw was tight. His hands were clasped between his knees. Children. She'll be okay, Nora said. Children. He didn't answer for a long moment. Children. My mother held her like that, he said finally, when she was sick. Children. Nora looked down at Rue, asleep now against her collarbone, the small weight of her. Children. I know, Nora said. It wasn't the right thing to say. There was no right thing. She said it anyway because she meant it, and meaning it was all she had. Children. Lorne didn't say anything else. But he didn't go back to bed either. He sat in the chair by the window until the sky outside began to go from black to the dark blue of early morning, and when Patrice and Benny came down the stairs at 7, he told them to be quiet because Rue was sleeping. Children. Arden came home on the evening of the second day. The roads had cleared enough. He came through the back door into a kitchen that smelled of eucalyptus and wood smoke, and something cooking slowly on the stove. Rue was asleep in a nest of blankets near the hearth. Lorne was at the table doing homework. Patrice was drawing. Benny was on the floor with a puzzle. Children. Arden stopped in the middle of the kitchen. Children. He looked at Rue. He looked at the room. He looked at Nora, who was at the stove stirring something without looking up. Children. She ran a fever, Nora said. Roads were closed. I managed it. Children. Arden set his keys on the counter. He walked to Rue's blanket nest, crouched down, put the back of his hand to her forehead. Rue stirred, blinked at him, and went back to sleep. He stayed crouched there for a moment. Then he straightened. Children. He walked to the stove. He stood behind Nora. He didn't touch her. He just stood close enough that she could feel the cold still radiating off his coat. Children. Thank you, he said. Children. 2 words, low and plain, with none of the warmth that phrase usually carries, but none of the performance either. She understood that from this man, plain was the same as sincere. Children. She kept stirring. Children. Supper's in 20 minutes, she said. Children. He sat down. Children. January buried the property. The snow came in sideways off the Rockies for 3 days straight, and when it stopped, the drifts along the north fence were chest-high. And the world outside the windows was so white it was almost violent to look at. They were cut off from Pincher Creek for 11 days. Children. 11 days of the 6 of them rattling around inside those cream-colored walls, learning each other's edges and rhythms, and the particular silences that meant different things at different times of day. Children. Nora learned that Arden woke at 4:30 regardless of the weather and lay still in the dark for 20 minutes before he got up, and that the sound of the coffee pot was what he moved toward, not conversation. She learned that Lorne was decent at mathematics and terrible at hiding this fact from himself. Children. She learned that Patrice would cry only in the bathroom, door locked, water running, and that afterward she'd come out with her face carefully arranged and go directly to a task. Children. As if industry could overwrite whatever had happened in there. She learned that Benny collected teeth, which she discovered by accident while making his bed. Children. A small tin on his windowsill containing 17 small white objects she chose not to examine closely. Children. And she learned that Rue had decided something about her, the exact nature of which was unclear, but which expressed itself each morning when Rue padded into the kitchen and stood silently beside Nora's left hip until someone noticed and lifted her onto the counter. Children. During the 11 days, Arden fixed the cellar latch properly. He didn't mention that she'd wired it together. He just replaced the hinge and the catch and set the door back and said nothing. Children. On the 8th day, the temperature dropped to -32. The pipes in the mudroom froze. Arden was outside with Lorne trying to get the cattle shelter sorted. Nora found the frozen section by feel, wrapped it in towels soaked in boiling water, and thawed it in 40 minutes. When Arden came back in and found the water running, he stood in the mudroom for a moment, looking at the towels. Children. He looked at her. Children. How'd you know to do that? He asked. Children. My grandfather's place had pipes that froze every February, she said. I grew up fixing things. Children. He nodded slowly, the way a person nods when they're filing something away. Not a compliment. Something more durable than that. Recognition. Children. By February, the rhythms of the place had restructured themselves around her, and she hadn't noticed until she noticed. She had a spot at the table, not assigned, just hers by repetition. She knew which burner ran hot. She knew that the third stair from the bottom squeaked, and that Benny used this knowledge to determine whether anyone was awake before he tried to raid the biscuit tin. Children. She knew that Lorne's hostility had shifted into something else, something she didn't have a clean word for, a watchful respect that expressed itself in small corrections. Like the time she was stacking hay bales wrong, and he showed her the right way without making it a lesson. Children. She also knew that Arden watched her when he thought she wasn't watching. Not in a way that made her uncomfortable, in a way that made her think of how a person studies a horizon. Not sure what they're looking for yet, but certain it's out there. Children. They drove to Pincher Creek in early March, the first real town run since January. The roads were passable, the truck loaded with Arden's list and Nora's own flour, salt, baking powder, thread, and a tin of good tea she was buying herself with the last of her $40. Children. The co-op was busy for a Thursday. People coming out of the long winter, the specific relief that shows on the faces of people who've survived another Alberta February without major incident. Children. Nora was at the hardware counter pricing out a new saw blade when she heard it. Children. Arden's woman. Children. Two talking near the seed display, not bothering to lower their voices. Children. His what? Children. He got himself a, girl from down south. Family sold her off to clear a debt, that's what Harold said. He was in the post office when it happened. Children. No. Children. 22, she's 22, he's got 4 children from Helen. Children. A pause, the soft, satisfied sound of judgment being organized. Children. Well, poor thing, she won't last the spring, they never do. Children. Nora set the saw blade down on the counter. Children. She picked it back up. She looked at the price. She put it in her basket. She walked to the end of the aisle, rounded the seed display, and stopped. Children. The 2 women, she recognized one of them, vaguely, from her father's church, a woman named something with a B, looked up. Children. The Holta place is running fine, Nora said. Her voice came out even, detached, almost like she was reporting weather. The children are fed and healthy. The pipes didn't freeze past the mudroom. The cattle came through the winter. She paused. I stayed. Children. Nobody said anything. The woman from the church opened her mouth and then closed it. Children. Nora went back to her shopping. Children. She was at the till 20 minutes later when Arden came in. He'd been at the fuel depot. He found her by the door, basket on the counter, waiting for her change. He looked at her face, whatever was showing on it, and then he looked at the 2 women still visible near the back of the store, watching. Children. He didn't ask. Children. He took Nora's basket and carried it to the truck. He loaded the boxes. He opened the passenger door. Children. When he got in on his side, he sat for a moment without starting the engine. Children. Who was it, he said. Children. Doesn't matter. Children. He looked at her. Children. You handled it, he said. Children. Yes. Children. He nodded. He started the truck. He pulled out of the parking lot and onto the highway, and the foothills rose up ahead of them, white-shouldered and enormous under the March sky, and he didn't say anything else. But at the cutoff, where the road to the property branched off from the highway, he said, You can plant whatever you want, come April. The kitchen garden's been sitting empty 2 years. It's yours. Children. She looked at him. It was the most consecutive words he'd offered voluntarily since she arrived. Children. I want tomatoes, she said. Children. Then plant tomatoes. Children. That was it. He turned down the cutoff road. The truck rocked over the packed snow. The property came into view, the farmhouse, the leaning barn. The enormous spruce windbreak along the north edge, roots so deep nothing short of the end of the world was pulling them out. She looked at it and felt something in her chest rearrange itself quietly, like furniture settling when the season changes. Children. It wasn't what she'd been given, it was what she'd stayed for. And staying, she'd discovered, was a different thing entirely. A choice made not once but every morning, in the dark, before anyone else was awake, when she stood at the stove and fed the fire back to life, and listened to the house breathe around her. Children. In June, Rue started talking in full sentences. Her first one, directed at Nora, was, "You put too much salt in the eggs." Children. Nora looked at her. Children. "Thank you," she said. Children. Rue considered this seriously, nodded, and went back to her toast. Children. By that summer, Lorne had stopped watching her like a leaking roof. He'd started watching her more like someone trying to understand a structure he hadn't built and didn't expect to like as much as he did. Children. He still didn't say much, but one afternoon in July, when she was fixing the fence along the east pasture, a job she hadn't been asked to do, children, just noticed needed doing, he came out and worked beside her for 2 hours without being told. Children. They worked in the same silence that Arden moved in, the comfortable kind, where the absence of words isn't emptiness but just room. Children. The wedding was in September, not a large thing. Arden's brother and his wife drove up from Fort Macleod. Nora's mother came alone, her father having declined. Children. They stood in the kitchen, because it was raining, under the low ceiling of the house that smelled now of bread and wood smoke and dog. They'd acquired a dog, an old cattle dog Benny had named Coin for reasons no one fully understood, and the justice of the peace said the words, and Arden slid a ring on her finger that had been his grandmother's, a plain gold band worn thin on one side. Children. Patrice cried. In the open, for once, not behind a locked door with water running, she cried, and didn't seem to mind who saw. Children. Lorne shook Arden's hand and then looked at Nora for a moment with those flat gray eyes that never gave much away, and then he shook her hand too. A firm, brief handshake, as formal as a contract. Children. She understood it was. Children. That first night, after the guests had gone and the children were in bed, Nora stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the September dark, the yard lit only by the barn light and the stars coming in, thick and cold above the spruce. Arden came and stood beside her. Children. He didn't say anything, neither did she, but he reached over and turned off the kitchen light so the window went dark and the outside came in properly. And they stood there, watching the sky for a while, the two of them, the empty kitchen behind them, and everything still ahead. Children. It was not a fairy tale. The bills were real. The winters were real. The grief those 4 children carried was real, and wouldn't be fixed, only carried differently with more hands to help. Children. But standing there with her shoulder just touching the sleeve of his coat, Nora thought about the woman in the co-op who'd said she wouldn't last the spring. Thought about her father's thumb on a ledger page. Children. Thought about the drive up to this property in November, the sky so flat and gray it looked painted. Children. She'd sat in that truck and felt the door locking behind her. Children. She hadn't known then that she was the one who'd been holding the key. Children. I keep thinking about the oatmeal. That pot Lorne dumped into the sink without a word, just to see what she'd do. Because that's usually how it starts, isn't it? Not with the big moments, but with the small, mean ones. The ones designed to find out if you'll fold. Children. Nora didn't fold, but I don't think that's the whole story. What I find myself sitting with, long after the telling is done, is the question of why she didn't. Because it wasn't stubbornness for its own sake. Children. It wasn't pride that needed an audience. She went back to the pantry, she got the pork and the beans, she put the pan on the stove, and she did it without making Lorne watch her do it. children. That's the part that stays with me. She gave him a way through that didn't require him to lose face. Children. And that, I think, is where the real intelligence of the thing lives. Not in the dramatic gesture, but in the quiet one. Children. There's something I've come to believe, watching stories like Nora's. The outcomes we earn aren't random. They follow the choices we make in the moments when no one's giving us credit. When Nora fixed the cellar latch, nobody asked her to. When she thawed the pipes, she didn't announce it. Children. When she sat up through the night with Rue burning in her lap, she wasn't performing courage. She was just doing what the situation required, with the steadiness she'd built over months of small, unglamorous decisions. That's a kind of cause and effect that doesn't announce itself. It accumulates quietly, the way snow accumulates, until one day the weight of it changes everything. Children. I think about Lorne shaking her hand at the wedding, that formal, brief handshake, serious as a contract. A 14-year-old boy who had started out looking at her like a leaking roof. Children. Standing there in his kitchen, extending his hand to the woman who'd sat on the floor all night, so his little sister wouldn't stop breathing. Something in him had done the accounting. Children. He'd watched her long enough to know what she was made of, and he respected it. Children. Not because she'd been warm or easy or tried to replace what he'd lost. Because she'd been honest and capable and she'd stayed. Integrity doesn't ask to be liked. It just keeps showing up, and eventually even the most grieving 14-year-old in the world notices. Children. What I keep returning to is this. Nora walked into that farmhouse with almost nothing except the willingness to do the next hard thing. She didn't have resources. She didn't have leverage. Children. She had her own competence, her own clear-eyed assessment of what needed doing, and the grit to do it past the point where most people would have stopped. That's not a talent you're born with. It's a muscle. Children. You build it by not stopping. Children. You build it by going back to the pantry when someone dumps your oatmeal in the sink. Children. She was handed a situation she didn't choose by people who didn't ask her, and she turned it over one Alberta winter into something that was genuinely hers. Not because she was given anything extra, because she didn't wait for permission to begin. Children. I don't think that story belongs only to Nora. I think most of us have walked into some version of that farmhouse, some place that smelled wrong, where nobody was glad to see us, where the work ahead looked like more than we had in us. The question Nora's story keeps asking me is the same one it was asking her. Every morning in the dark, before anyone else woke up. Are you going to feed the fire, or aren't you?